Welcome everyone to our Faithlife Live. I am so excited to be talking to you today. I'm so excited to have our guest, Dr. Karen Mason. She is absolutely wonderful. I've talked to her before. She is a professor of counseling at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. Her research has focused on the clergy's and faith community's role in suicide prevention. This introduction, it just scratches the surface in ways that God is using Dr. Mason to help bring healing in an area that is often not talked about within the church. She's a native of Colorado. She learned to speak French while growing up in France, some German while living in Austria, and some Haitian Creole while living in Haiti, teaching at Hope Academy. She's also lived in Pakistan, teaching at Murray Christian School. She completed an MA in Old Testament at Denver Seminary and an MA and PhD in counseling psychology at the University of Denver. Dr. Mason, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so happy to see you again, Ryland, and just great to be here.
Well, it really is an honor. You are a joy to talk to, and I know our audience is going to get a lot out of our time today. We're talking about the current mental health of pastors, and as we're doing this, if you're watching and you're watching live, feel free to like this live stream, share it, share the social media, let other people know that this is taking place, and in the chat, let us know where you're coming from. We love, I'm amazed, Dr. Mason, when we do this, it will be an international affair. We will have people from just all over the world joining for these live streams, and it's the only time in the history of the world that we've ever been able to do it. So even with all the Zoom fatigue, I'm so glad to do this. So everybody put where you're from in the chat. And as we go through these questions and Dr. Mason talks about pastoral health in the church, if you have any questions, audience, please put those in the chat. We're going to come back to those at the end of our time together. We want you to be able to ask and Dr. Mason to answer questions. And so feel free to put any questions in the chat and we will get those to her. Well, Dr. Mason, you don't need a study to see that pastors' mental health is not always great. And we've all heard about pastors who have died by suicide, but we haven't heard as much about pastors who take a step back or suffer in silence. And I don't think it's gotten better since the pandemic started. Our survey showed that more than 10% of pastors considered suicide in the past 12 months. And I'm sure you can talk to that in much greater detail. But when we're talking about pastors and church leaders in particular, are there any certain risk factors that make pastors more likely to struggle with mental health issues like depression and anxiety, more likely to consider suicide? And then what are those warning signs that pastors and people in close relationships with pastors should be looking for?
Yeah, such important questions. Thank you. And Ryland, call me Karen. So, one of my colleagues is very fond of saying this, and I think it's just so true, and that's that pastors are just like everybody else, only more so. That's from Dr. David Curry, who runs our cohort-based studies ministries at Gordon Conwell. And the thing is, people in the church just feel like suicidal thinking or having mental health concerns, conditions is a sign of difficulties with their faith. And I think pastors are like that, only more so. So people in the church feel like they have to have it all together. Pastors feel like they have to have it all together. And so when they don't, that can create an additional kind of stress, I think, that pastors experience. I think also that, there's, as you said, there's a good amount of research out there that pastors do struggle more so even than the national population around depression and anxiety. And I'm sure you have a lot of stories along this line, but pastors tend to be a little bit of the lightning rod for criticism in churches. So when something isn't going quite right, or if there's a change to be made, like do we sing hymns or worship songs pastors tend to get some criticism because, if you choose one side, you're going to make the other side unhappy. Rylan, just before we got started, we were talking about masking in churches. Just those kinds of decisions are sometimes really hard to negotiate, and sometimes pastors end up being a little bit of a lightning rod for congregants who maybe the way they wanted to do it isn't the way that got picked. So I think what's so hard is just the constant criticism. The other thing is the sort of constant switching pastors have to do. So pastors are part of a church, but and part of the community, but they're really also leaders. And that role switching back and forth can be a challenge for pastors. So I've had other pastors talk to me about how you live out life in a fishbowl. There's that fishbowl that you're in, and that can create some challenges. The sense that you're never quite helping people enough with the suffering that they're experiencing. So I think there are all kinds of unique challenges that pastors face, specific kinds of job stress. So they have all the usual stresses of figuring out how to live a life of faith in a very complex world. Just what Dr. Curry says, they're just like everybody else, only more so. They've got all those human stresses. And then there are these unique job stresses, I think, that they're also experiencing. So it makes some sense that pastors struggle, not all pastors, but that some pastors would struggle with mental health conditions and maybe even suicidal thinking. The other piece I'll just throw in there is that 1 in 5 Americans has a mental health condition. 1 in 5, 20%. That's a lot of people. Some of those people are pastors. Mm-hmm. So, we think faith protects us from all suffering in the world, and that just doesn't seem to fit with what we see around us. And so it makes some sense, actually, that pastors struggle with mental health. Did I get there? Somehow I feel like there was one last little part of your question I haven't addressed yet.
No, I think you answered that well. I do want to remind people as we're getting going that we're talking about pastoral health with Dr. Karen Mason. She's asked me to call her Karen. Out of respect for her, I'm going to do that. And if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We're having a deeper dive into pastoral health, mental health of pastors, and mental health issues within the church. And so you can leave questions that we will get to at the end. Karen, one of the things that you talked about was these added pressures for pastors. One of the things that comes to mind for me that we talked about a minute ago is the stigma that can come with mental health. What do we do as pastors, as churches, when someone believes the stigma, well, this is just a faith issue, and we're talking about mental health? How do you respond to that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there are just so many people in the Bible who struggled with, and I'll talk about mental health in general, but certainly also with just plain old thoughts of suicide. So, or wanting to die at least. So Moses in Numbers 11 says, God, go ahead and just kill me. Elijah in 1 Kings 19, go ahead and just kill me. Jonah in Jonah 4. Go ahead and just kill me, God, because at this point in time, I just don't want to live anymore. So we have examples of people in the Bible who have, who are people of great faith. We can also think about someone like Dr. Edward J. Carnell, who was a previous president of Fuller Seminary back when Fuller first got started, who struggled with suicidal thinking. So, we have all these examples of people of faith who struggle with suicidal thinking. We also have examples of people of faith, like Spurgeon, who was just an amazing preacher. He was called the Prince of Preachers, who talks about, I hope none of you descend into just the depths of just depression that I experienced. We have other people, in the Bible who you can read through some of the Psalms, like Psalm 82, 88, who just talk about just the depths of despair that they're experiencing. So I think we need to challenge that perspective, because it just doesn't seem consistent, at least for me, with what I read in the Bible. And then also just the fact that we just know about Christians who have struggled with these issues.
Oh, that's excellent. And one of the things I want to mention, we're going to drop the link in the chat, but you and Dr. Scott Gibson have written a book called Preaching Hope in Darkness, Help Pastors in Addressing Suicide from the Pulpit. I believe this came out in 2020 on Lexham Press. We have it at logos.com. I read it when it first came out as someone who was on staff at a church. So helpful, because you all address some of those ways that we think about stigma and mental health and suicidal thoughts. And so we're going to have that link in the chat. I want to encourage people to check out that book. What do pastors and church leaders need most from people around them, particularly when they're struggling with their mental health? So we've got a pastor at a church. He's having suicidal thoughts, not really sure what to do. And he's scared if he brings it up, all the security, job loss, all those things. So what do pastors and church leaders need from those around them when they're struggling with mental health?
Yeah, great question. I just think, I think this is true for pastors, only more so. I think it's true for congregants as well, that we have a tendency to believe that everybody, because we're people of faith, should have it all together. I have heard that from many people, just that expectation, people that I've interviewed, that expectation that Christians shouldn't in fact suffer, which is really, again, contrary. You can read the chapter 11 of the book of Hebrews. A lot of people of great faith have suffered. But we have that tendency to believe that Christians don't suffer, or there should be a word that helps us get through that suffering so that we don't have to suffer. And so when people suffer and kind of don't have it all together, there is a real stigma around that. And congregants feel that, but pastors feel that even more so. So I think people put pastors on pedestals. And so the reason I think Dave Curry says pastors are just like everybody else, only more so, I think he's trying to get pastors off that pedestal so that in fact they can reach out for help, right? They can in fact do that. Now, by the way, I think for pastors, that's especially challenging because, as I said, pastors are not just members of their church, they're also leaders in their church. And so what seasoned pastors have talked to me more so than anything else is having a group of people that they can share with. It might be fellow pastors in their community. I've heard from many seasoned pastors that they have a group of pastors that they met in seminary that has just carried them through their life of ministry, where they can reach out for help, that we're some group where it just feels safe for them to be able to do that. So I think what do pastors and church leaders need most is a sense of safety, some place where they're able to feel that sense of safety, where they can reach out for help if in fact they're struggling with mental health issues like depression or anxiety or even suicidal thinking.
That's so helpful. So much of, love, it casts out the darkness, and darkness wants to be isolated, right? And so what you're saying, that community, it pulls us back in. So helpful. Well, people in the pews, it's not just pastors, but people in our congregations, they're struggling with mental health too. As you said, it's all people thing. how can pastors care well for their people when they're struggling with similar issues?
Well, it's such a great question, and I think the question really makes me think also of the fact that I'm a psychologist, and sometimes there are people that I can't work with, right? Because it'll bring up something that's going to be difficult for me. So I think you do have to know yourself. There are sometimes you're able to put your concerns aside and be able to help other people. But if that isn't working, then I think it is important for pastors to find other people in the church who can come alongside those who are hurting, whether it's maybe a Stephen Ministries program or the deacons in the church. One thing that I hear so much in interviews I do is that pastors are very clear that this is not just their ministry. This is the church's ministry. And I think pastors need to know themselves well enough to know, at what point is this just not going to be helpful, maybe for themselves or for the person that they're coming alongside, and who else is in the church who can help, right? I think sometimes we'd really like to be the Messiah to everybody, but that we are human beings. That is hard to. There's one Messiah, and it's Jesus, right?
Amen. Well, bridging on that, what are some of the signs that pastor needs to recognize when it's time to refer someone in the congregation to someone with more specialized training in mental health? What are those signs that pastors need to be looking for? Anybody in the congregation, elders, deacons, what are the signs that it's time to refer?
Yes, I think when something looks like it's getting worse. So, for instance, it could be a person might, not be attending school occasionally, but all of a sudden they don't attend at all. They might be missing work occasionally, but then all of a sudden they just don't even get out of bed. So when something starts to get worse, that's definitely a signal that you need to escalate on some level the intervention. Think of whatever that next step is. So one of the things too that could be helpful in that situation is, I just want to mention the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, 1-800-273-TALK. If you ever have a question that you're really just like, I just am not really sure what to do in this situation, you can reach out to them and get some consultation. The other thing is that many churches do have mental health professionals, counselors who, without sharing personal information, confidential information, you might be able to get some consultation there.
That's excellent. I think we're going to put in the chat, in the comments, the suicide prevention hotline for people, and wonderful advice. And then when pastors, whether they're struggling or not struggling right now, how do they talk about the issue like suicide and mental health from the pulpit? How does someone do that? Because that can be a overwhelming conversation to have, all the things that run in the mind of how are we going to do this? So how does a pastor or a preacher talk about it from the pulpit?
Yes, yeah. Well, the first thing they should do is read the book, Preaching Hope in Darkness. Just put a little plug for the book in there. Rylan and you and I were talking before we got started, and that appendix, the appendices in the book are just really practical, I would say. So there's lots of good examples in there of how you might, tackle this notion of preaching. So there's a couple things that I keep in mind. One of them is just that mentioning the word suicide does not make it more likely to happen. All right. So this is what one pastor told me in an interview, and I just love this. Just because you preach on adultery doesn't mean it's going to happen more in the church. So we have that figured out with adultery. We need to apply that same thing to suicide, right? I think also there's a real fear of talking about suicide. So part of it is the fear that somehow I'm going to plant the idea in a person's mind, which hasn't been borne out in the research. But the other thing I think is that we're just worried about, what are the words to use, right? It's a difficult topic. There's a lot of stigma and silence around the topic. But here's one idea I'll just throw out besides reading the book, which I think is my best suggestion. But one of the things to keep in mind is that when you preach through the Bible, which many pastors do that, suicide shows up in the Bible, and it's worth just noticing that as you're going through the text. So for instance, as I said, Moses, Elijah, Jonah, they all wanted to die. We have a wonderful example of suicide prevention in Acts 16. Paul prevents the suicide of the Philippian jailer. That's in the Bible. There are, suicides in the Bible. One of the examples is Ahithophel, right? Sounds like you're sneezing, but Ahithophel was David's advisor who turned to help Absalom. And when Absalom didn't take his advice, Ahithophel went to his hometown and killed himself. So in the book, Preaching Hope in Darkness, we also talk about different topics, I think, that are just so important to people who are struggling with suicide, which is hope and a theology of life and reasons for living, and what does it mean when you're suffering? How can we make sense out of this as Christians? And is it okay, in fact, to reach out for help, or do we have to show up at church with our shiny, pretty selves, as a pastor once told me? So I think it's important to go ahead and go ahead and preach these passages that you find in the Bible, and go ahead and mention the fact about suicide. And I think one of the biggest reasons is otherwise people who are suicidal or who have lost someone to suicide are going to wonder if the church is relevant to them. And it is. And the Bible is relevant. God cares about this issue. God cares about these people. We need to minister to these people. These people need to know that that their struggles are relevant. And I think one of the ways we make that clear is going ahead and mentioning that topic. It could be in prayers. It could be in just plain old preaching through the text.
Well, and one of the things that you and Scott do so well, it's in the title of the book, but it's hope. It is that there is hope for people in this issue. We're not isolated. Even there just a moment ago, I was ready to say amen, because it's the hope of the gospel to change our lives. Well, let's say that someone in our church, someone's church, they're confessing suicidal thoughts. Yeah. Who in the church needs to know that information? And then how does the church get training to help handle those sorts of issues?
Yes. Yeah. Great question. So one thing I'll say right off the bat, you were asking who needs to know. If you have a kiddo in your youth group who's under 18, their parents should know. So just kind of FYI, that's something to keep in mind, just because parents are the people who are in charge of the medical care of their child. So, but there are a lot of, I couldn't say this 10 years ago, but now there are a lot of great trainings out there for churches to figure out how to negotiate this issue. So I'm going to mention a few, but let me just give you an example using Living Works. So Living Works is a kind of one of the premier providers of suicide intervention training. And they have just a wonderful pastor, used to be a military chaplain, Glenn Bloomstrom, who is now in charge of their faith initiatives, who teaches at Bethlehem Seminary up in, it's either St. Paul or Minneapolis, but who helped them develop Living Works Faith. So that's just an excellent faith-based training that's really focused on um, creating a safety net, so to speak, in a church. And one of the ways you can do that is you can look at sort of broadly anyone who's interested in this concern, they could get trained in something called Living Works Start. And then people who want a little bit more training could take Safe Talk. And then say the youth pastor, the leader of the youth group, maybe should get trained in assists. And Living Works Faith might be the training that the lead pastor gets. So there are ways of taking these trainings and finding the people who are interested in that particular topic area and finding the training that really targets them, that really helps them be ready to just notice, is this person getting worse? If that person is getting worse, who do I refer that person to at the church, right? So really giving that some thought in terms of who's interested, who's going to come into contact with suicidal adults or suicidal adolescents, and how do we make sure we know how to intervene in those situations. But let me just give you 4 different groups that you could even think about in terms of getting some training. So Living Works is one I mentioned. Remedy Live is a group out of Indiana that does training for schools and youth groups. Soul Shop is a training that a group that'll come into the church as a whole. Be Nice is a training that it was instituted in Western Michigan, but has really taken root in churches in Western Michigan. So there's just a number of possible trainings to seek after. And these different companies can really help you think about who in the church should really be in that training.
That's excellent. Well, we've got some questions that have come in from our audience, and if someone is still watching, get the question into the chat pretty quickly. But these are from people that have been watching, and they're interested in your thoughts. Karen, what is your advice for families of pastors who are struggling with mental health?
Families, like the kids and the wife who are struggling with mental health. Well, I can tell you, if there's a fishbowl around the pastor, there's a definite fishbowl around the family, right? Mm-hmm. And if there are expectations that pastors should somehow be superhuman, that's certainly true with their family members as well. So I've talked to many pastors' wives who just kind of shrug their shoulders and say, I don't know why they think I went to seminary too. It's extremely challenging for the family members. And again, I think it's really important to find people, because you're part of the church, but you're kind of not part of the church at the same time. Mm-hmm. It's just really important to find some people that you can be safe with, authentic with, who will be non-judgmental, because there's plenty of judgment. I was talking about criticism that comes the direction of the pastor. Certainly enough judgment that comes in the direction of the family.
You are so right. When my wife and I would interview with the church, they would often ask her, how do you feel about being a preacher's wife? And she would say, well, I'm going to stay married to Ryland regardless of what he does for vocation. And she set those expectations up early. Now, those expectations can be so harsh. And so I appreciate you mentioning those. What are you talked about this recently, but maybe you can dive into just a little bit more. Someone wants to know more information about the signs of depression to look for.
Signs of depression. So again, you're looking for changes, right? So it could be Sleeping more, but it could be sleeping less. Okay. It could be eating more, it could be eating less. But generally speaking, a person who either reports feeling down or kind of blue, but the other way to really kind of grab a hold of that idea is if they start pulling away from the things they used to be interested in. All right. So, for instance, Jeff Elhart, who lost his brother to suicide, was beginning to become depressed, and he usually would. He loved boating. Lived right near Lake Michigan. He stopped putting his boat in the water. All right. So that is the kind of thing that you want to be noticing. Right. So any kind of major change, you used to go to work every day and now you don't. You used to go to school, now you don't. It can also show up, depression can also show up, especially in men, as irritability. All right. So what's interesting, the face of depression is a woman crying, right? That's kind of the expectation. It doesn't show up that way in men quite as much. It shows up more as irritability, loss of interest in things that used to be interesting, and then some kind of change. Used to be sleep well, now you don't, for whatever reason.
Very helpful, very helpful. Been looking out for changes. And then we have one more, and I hope I understand this correctly. It sounds like a good question. I'm going to ask it, and then hopefully we'll understand it. The question is there a line that once crossed, the anger is stronger than the desire to hold on to God?
The anger at God, does it mean the desire to kill yourself?
I think so. I think they're wondering if there's a line that can be crossed where, what do you do when the anger is stronger than your desire to hold on to God?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I'll say two things about that. One of them is it can take like a year from the first time you have a thought of suicide to where you're actually planning out and intending to kill yourself, right? That's something that develops over time. That the decision to kill yourself right then and there usually happens quickly. All right. So when this person was asking about a line, that's what comes to mind for me, is that sort of decision that can happen quickly. Now, the other thing that kind of brought up for me is Jonah, who's sitting on the side of the mountain, being really angry at God for not destroying the Ninevites, and he is so angry at God, and he says, "God, kill me." Right? So clearly, anger can be connected there with suicidal thoughts, but he doesn't kill himself, right? There is anger, but he doesn't, quote unquote, cross that line into actually killing himself. He's angry, but I don't know if that line, there's not an example in my mind of that happening. But here's the thing, and this is something I feel that's so important, is that as Christians, we just need to make sure we're talking to people about reasons for living, a theology of life, in the context of suffering, especially in the context of limiting circumstances. Why should Christians keep hanging in there? Why should they have hope? I keep thinking about Joseph in Genesis 50. You meant this for evil, but God meant it for good. How do you keep hanging on to that hope that God is still sovereign, God is still powerful in my difficult circumstances? How do you keep hanging on to that, right? And I think that that's what's so important. That hope of the gospel is really the hope of redemption in my difficult circumstances today. And I think that's what we're hoping people hang on to in those difficult moments when the pain is just overwhelming.
Oh, well, Karen, I can't think of a better way for us to close our time. You have been an absolute joy. This time has been meaningful for me personally. I've been in counseling before. I've been on medication. All the things you're saying are true. This is not about me. I just want to say from a personal level, thank you for being here. Every time I hear you speak, it always reminds me there's hope. God loves us. He loves me. And the work you're doing is so invaluable. I hope our audience has been blessed. And so, Karen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And so until next time, God bless.
God bless.